In August 1969, the world came within reach of witnessing the first nuclear exchange between two communist powers. It was not a scenario anyone had anticipated when the Second World War ended. It was not the kind of war that military planners in Washington had imagined during 2 decades of Cold War. But there it was, completely real. The Soviet Ministry of Defense had developed detailed plans to launch precision airstrikes, possibly with tactical nuclear weapons, against China's nuclear installations in the Xinjiang region, specifically targeting the Lop Nur test site. Marshal Grechko, the Soviet defense minister, and General Zhukov, chief of the general staff, had presented to Brezhnev's Politburo a proposal they described as surgical strikes, rapid, precise blows designed to destroy China's nuclear capability before it could threaten Soviet territory. Brezhnev, according to documents from the period and testimonies of Soviet officials collected in the decades that followed, gave tacit approval to the planning of that option. Soviet diplomats began quietly probing foreign governments about their reactions to a possible Soviet preemptive strike against China. When those soundings reached Washington, the response that Richard Nixon's government sent back to Moscow changed the Soviet calculation definitively. This is the story of how two powers that had been allies less than 2 decades earlier came to the edge of nuclear war, and how the most powerful alliance in the communist world became the most dangerous geopolitical confrontation of 1969. To understand why the Soviet Union came to seriously consider a nuclear strike against China, you first need to understand how two countries that in 1950 had signed a 30-year treaty of friendship and alliance ended up, less than 20 years later, launching military operations against each other on a tiny, snow-covered island in the Ussuri River. The story of the Sino-Soviet alliance begins in December 1949, when Mao Zedong made his first foreign trip as leader of the newly proclaimed People's Republic of China. The journey to Moscow was, from Mao's perspective, an exercise in calculated humiliation. Stalin made him wait weeks before granting an audience. The treaty negotiations were slow and in many moments deliberately degrading. Stalin insisted on conditions that treated China more like a satellite state than an equal ally. The treaty that was finally signed in February 1950, the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, came with a loan of $300 million at low interest and the promise of Soviet technical assistance for China's industrial development. It was a beginning, but Mao remembered it for years as the experience of sitting across from someone who treated him as a subordinate. During the early years of the alliance, the Soviet Union provided China with assistance that was genuinely important for the country's development. Thousands of Soviet technicians and advisors helped build factories, railways, and power plants. Military cooperation was substantial during the Korean War. And in the 1950s, Moscow even began sharing nuclear technology with China. Soviet engineers helped construct the Beijing Research Reactor, and in 1957 an agreement was signed that included the promise to provide China with a prototype atomic bomb. It was that promise, and its subsequent cancellation, that began fracturing the alliance. Nikita Khrushchev, who assumed Soviet power after Stalin's death in 1953, represented a vision of communism that Mao found fundamentally unacceptable. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's crimes before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was for Mao something far more than a criticism of a dead leader. It was a direct threat to the legitimacy of the personality cult Mao was constructing in China. And it was also a signal that the Soviet leadership was willing to relativize the methods Mao considered essential to revolution. The doctrine of peaceful coexistence that Khrushchev articulated was the most explicit point of ideological rupture. Khrushchev argued that the existence of nuclear weapons had fundamentally changed the nature of the confrontation between capitalism and socialism, that a nuclear war would be devastating for both sides, and that therefore socialism must triumph through economic and political competition, not through armed conflict. Mao rejected that vision with a vehemence that his Politburo colleagues sometimes found difficult to follow. His reflections on nuclear war, which circulated in party documents and eventually reached Moscow, were deeply unsettling to Khrushchev. Mao argued that even if a nuclear war destroyed half of humanity, the surviving half would be sufficient to build communism. It was a willingness to contemplate nuclear apocalypse as an acceptable outcome that Khrushchev described in his memoirs as the position of an adventurer. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was, from Mao's perspective, the definitive confirmation of his assessment of Khrushchev. When the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba after the confrontation with Kennedy, Mao publicly declared that Khrushchev had moved from adventurism to capitulation. It was a criticism that damaged the Soviet Union's reputation within the international communist movement. In 1959, Khrushchev canceled the agreement to share nuclear technology with China, arguing that Mao's positions made it too dangerous to arm Beijing with that kind of capability. In 1960, the Soviet technicians who had been working in China were abruptly withdrawn, taking their blueprints with them and leaving dozens of industrial projects half-finished. For China, the withdrawal of the technicians was an economic blow and a political humiliation simultaneously. The border between the Soviet Union and China is the longest in the world, stretching thousands of kilometers from Central Asia to the Far East. The Treaty of Beijing of 1860, signed between the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty at a time when China was militarily weak and Russia was an expanding imperial power, had established borders that China considered imposed by force. Mao had publicly declared that China had claims over vast territories that treaty had ceded to the Russian Empire. And the Chinese rhetoric about lost lands escalated throughout the 1960s. The islands of the Ushiri River, which served as the border between the two countries in the Far East, were a particular point of friction. They were pieces of land, mostly uninhabited and without any significant strategic value, but they had become symbols of the broader border dispute. Since the mid-1960s, incidents between Chinese and Soviet military patrols on those islands have become frequent. March 2, 1969. One of those incidents became something qualitatively different in the early hours of that day. A group of Chinese soldiers crossed the ice of the Ushiri River onto Zhenbao Island, known on Soviet maps as Damansky Island. According to Soviet records, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Strelnikov led a patrol of border guards to intercept the Chinese group. What followed was an ambush. The Chinese soldiers opened fire. A second Chinese unit concealed on the riverbank joined the attack. Strelnikov and several of his men died in the first minutes. In the clashes that followed that day, and in subsequent days, 58 Soviet soldiers were killed, and a larger number of Chinese soldiers, though the exact figures on the Chinese side have been a subject of historical debate. The Soviet government's reaction was one of fury that surprised many observers. The Politburo convened an emergency session. Soviet newspapers published front-page images of the dead soldiers and described them as victims of a deliberate armed provocation. In Soviet cities, enraged crowds surrounded the Chinese embassy in Moscow and destroyed Chinese property. From the Soviet perspective, the Zhenbao ambush had not been an accidental border incident, but a state-planned operation. Soviet military documents that historians have been able to examine in the decades since show intelligence analyses identifying the attack as an operation organized by an elite Chinese unit that had been deployed in the area weeks earlier. From the Chinese perspective, which party documents and subsequent testimonies of officials confirm, the Zhenbao operation was indeed planned. Mao wanted to demonstrate that China would not yield to Soviet pressure and that it was capable of inflicting significant military casualties on the Soviet Union. It was also a way to consolidate domestic support at a moment when the Cultural Revolution had created enormous political chaos. The months that followed March 2nd, 1969 were of a tension that participants and observers would describe decades later as the most dangerous period of the entire Sino-Soviet conflict. Border skirmishes continued through the summer of 1969, with incidents on Zhenbao Island and at other points along the border in Central Asia. The Soviet military responded by escalating its own forces in the Far East. The number of Soviet military divisions deployed on the Chinese border had increased from approximately 15 in 1964 to more than 40 in 1969. That deployment included armored forces, long-range artillery, and medium-range ballistic missiles of the SS-4 class. which could strike virtually any target on Chinese territory. It was in that context of sustained military escalation that debates within the Soviet Politburo began to include options that weeks earlier would have seemed inconceivable. Marshal Grechko presented the proposal of preemptive strikes as a solution to the strategic problem China represented. His argument was that China, whose first nuclear device had detonated in 1964 and whose ballistic missile program was advancing rapidly, would within a few years become a first-rank nuclear power with the capability to threaten Soviet territory. If they waited too long, the window of opportunity to destroy that program would close. The Lop Nur test site in the desert region of Xinjiang was the heart of the Chinese nuclear program. It was also, given its remote location, the most obvious target of the operation Grechko was proposing. The plans the Soviet General Staff developed included the use of medium-range ballistic missiles to destroy Lop Nur and other facilities of the Chinese nuclear program in a rapid, coordinated strike. The most extraordinary dimension of this entire episode was the manner in which the Soviets began testing international reactions to the possibility of that strike. In August 1969, Soviet diplomats began approaching officials of several governments, including that of the United States, to ask how they would react to a Soviet preemptive strike against Chinese nuclear installations. It was August 27, 1969, when CIA Director Richard Helms publicly disclosed at a press conference, surprising many observers, that Moscow had been making consultations about a possible preemptive attack against China. It was a deliberate leak that Nixon's government had authorized. Its purpose was to send a clear message to Moscow that the United States knew what they were considering, and that this information was now public. What followed in the weeks after was one of the most extraordinary diplomatic maneuvers of the entire Cold War. Nixon's government, which was in the process of completely rethinking American foreign policy toward China and had begun the first secret contacts with Beijing, decided that a Soviet nuclear attack on China was not in the strategic interests of the United States. The way Washington communicated that position to Moscow combined official and parallel channels. Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in Washington received messages that made clear the United States would not remain neutral in the face of a Soviet nuclear attack on China. The warning, transmitted with the deliberate ambiguity that characterized Cold War nuclear diplomacy, was that a nuclear war between the two largest communist powers could destabilize the international system in a way the United States could not ignore. Chinese documents that began becoming public decades later add an additional layer to this episode. Kosygin told Brezhnev on October 15, 1969, that Washington had made clear that China's interests are closely related to their own, and that they have developed detailed plans for a nuclear war against us if the Soviet Union attacks China. That same day, Dobrynin reported to Brezhnev from Washington, if China suffers a nuclear attack, they will consider it the beginning of World War III. These were messages that changed Brezhnev's calculation fundamentally. The benefit of destroying the Chinese nuclear program was real, but limited in time. The risk of triggering a conflict with the United States was potentially civilizational. Grechko's option was discarded. At the same time, Nixon made another decision that on October 13, 1969, he placed American strategic nuclear forces on elevated alert. That alert was executed in a manner deliberately visible to Soviet surveillance systems. Its purpose included sending a signal to Moscow that any major military action in Asia would have consequences involving American nuclear forces. China's reaction to the Soviet nuclear threat was as revealing as Washington's maneuver. Mao Zedong, who had spent years preaching that atomic bombs were paper tigers, took the Soviet threat of 1969 with a seriousness that his public declarations did not reflect. The measures the Chinese government adopted included the partial evacuation of party leadership out of Beijing and emergency meetings of the Central Military Commission to assess the situation. Veteran generals presented Mao with sober evaluations. China had nuclear weapons, but in limited numbers. Its delivery systems were primitive compared to the Soviet arsenal, and its capacity to survive a Soviet first strike and respond was highly uncertain. China's response took a form that combined deterrence with calculated provocation. that on September 23rd and 29th, 1969, China conducted 2 underground nuclear tests at Lop Nur. These tests were not accompanied by official announcements or invitations to foreign observers. They were conducted in silence, but in a way that the world's seismic monitoring systems registered the explosions without any ambiguity that it was a strategic message sent through the planet's seismic waves. China had nuclear weapons. It was actively testing them. And any calculation about the vulnerability of the Chinese nuclear program to a preemptive strike had to account for the fact that that program was more advanced and more resilient than Soviet planners could know with certainty. The confluence of all these signals, the American warning, the Chinese nuclear tests, the potential international condemnation, and the divisions within the Politburo itself, was what finally led Brezhnev to reject the military option. Kosygин's meeting with Zhou Enlai at Beijing Airport on September 11th, 1969, was the public signal that the escalation toward war had been halted and that both sides were looking for a way out. The most important and most transformative consequence of the entire crisis was the one Nixon and Kissinger had calculated. The willingness of the United States to protect China against the Soviet threat created the conditions for the Sino-American rapprochement that Nixon materialized with his historic visit to Beijing in February 1972. It was one of the most spectacular geopolitical reversals of the Cold War. The principal capitalist state became the deterrent force protecting the largest communist state from its own socialist ally. Mao Zedong, who had spent 20 years denouncing American imperialism as the principal enemy of the world's peoples, received Nixon in Beijing with the courtesy of someone who knows that real geopolitics operates in ways far more complex than ideological rhetoric. For the Soviet Union, the outcome of 1969 was the confirmation that the break with China was irreversible. The country that had been Moscow's greatest potential ally in Asia had become an adversary seeking cooperation with Washington precisely at the moments when confrontation with the USSR was most intense. Brezhnev would spend the 1970s trying to manage the threat China represented without ceasing to confront the Western world, a two-front strategic situation that consumed resources and attention that would have been needed elsewhere. The 1969 conflict was also the detonator that accelerated China's ballistic missile program. China understood that security against the Soviet Union required its own nuclear deterrent capability, one that no external ally could reliably substitute. It was the final lesson of the crisis. The Sino-Soviet alliance, which had seemed the most powerful bloc in world communism, had produced as its final result two powers threatening each other with the arsenal they had built in part thanks to their previous cooperation. The Soviet technicians who in the 1950s had helped construct China's nuclear reactor had contributed, without knowing it, to creating the program that 20 years later their own generals were planning to destroy. The day the USSR planned to annihilate Mao's China with nuclear weapons was not the day the world ended. It was the day it became clear that ideologies, however powerful, cannot bend the national interests of states, and that the socialist brotherhood Stalin and Mao had proclaimed in 1950 had never been more than an alliance of convenience between two powers with different visions of the world and ambitions that would inevitably collide. The Soviet Union and China finally sat down to negotiate their border in October 1969. The talks lasted years and produced no definitive agreement until 1991. By then, the Soviet Union had less than 2 months to live. This is the story they buried beneath decades of Cold War mythology. The moment when the world's two largest communist powers aimed their nuclear arsenals at each other, and when the United States, without firing a single shot, changed the course of history with a diplomatic signal transmitted through seismic waves and careful ambiguity. The story of how ideology dies when survival begins, and how the alliances that seemed eternal turn out to be the most fragile constructions in the history of the 20th century. If this story shook something in you, if it made you see how close the world came to a catastrophe no one was supposed to know about, then you already understand why the fall of power exists. This channel was built for exactly these stories. The ones buried under official narratives. The decisions made in closed rooms that changed everything. The history that the powerful needed you never to fully understand. Subscribe to The Fall of Power right now. Leave a like if this story deserved to be told. Share it with someone who thinks the Cold War was only between Washington and Moscow. And activate the notification bell, because the next file is already open, and what it reveals will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world that was built around you. The archive does not close.